Hey everybody, welcome to Thursday. Just going to give you a quick rundown of what we're doing today and go over some anaerobic respiration notes. So first thing up, we're going to finish up those respiration notes. Watch this video, follow along. Remember, you can always stop, rewind, go back if you missed anything. That's the great thing about a video. Next up, you will do the How Oxygen Affects Cells assignment. I am going to post a video about the graphing portion of it because it's a little confusing, but once you get that down, you should be able to go on with the assignment. This is what we did in class yesterday, so just keep things the same, and I think it'll be good. Last thing, test corrections are due tomorrow for the photosynthesis test, so you can take this time to do those as well. Okay, so quick review of things. No need to write any of this down. Remember, we've been talking about cellular respiration, the process that makes ATP by breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen. We called that aerobic. Remember, aerobic means with oxygen. We need that energy, the ATP, to do chemical reactions in our cells. And we talked about the three stages, the glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, with most of the ATP being made in the electron transport chain. Now, what if oxygen is absent? Okay, we don't always have oxygen available, and there are some organisms who don't even need oxygen to survive and make energy. If oxygen is absent, cells are going to go through this process called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic just means without oxygen. So what is it? Well, you're still breaking down glucose into some smaller pieces, and you're gaining 2 ATP from it. That is all of the ATP that you get from anaerobic respiration. Remember, aerobic, we got like 36 total. Anaerobic, we're only getting 2, so it's a lot less energy. There's 2 steps to anaerobic respiration. Glycolysis, really just the same glycolysis that was in aerobic, and fermentation. That's the second step. So first up, glycolysis. This is just a rundown or review of it. It's literally the exact same as before. Remember, glycolysis means the splitting of glucose, glyco being glucose, lysis to split. We're going to make 2 pyruvic acids from that, just like before. And once again, we had to put 2 ATP into start. We get a total of 4 produced for a profit or net gain of 2 ATP, just like before. Okay. Also, these electrons and some hydrogens are going to get removed from glucose. They're going to hook up with some NAD+, and they're going to make some NADH. Now, typically in aerobic respiration, the NADH would go to the electron transport chain, but here it doesn't, it just chills out, it goes to fermentation. Okay, so my end result here, I have 2 ATP, 2 pyruvic acids, and some NADH. Now, the next step here, fermentation. Okay, what does fermentation mean? Well, fermentation is just the incomplete breakdown of organic compounds in the absence of oxygen. So if I think back to aerobic respiration, when I was doing the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, I fully broke down the glucose into, the final products of some CO2 and water. That doesn't happen in fermentation, okay? I don't completely break these down. Therefore, I'm not really gaining all of the, or releasing all of the energy stored in glucose. There's 2 main types of fermentation we're going to talk about. First one's called alcoholic. Might be familiar with that one. Second one is lactic acid. Maybe you're also familiar with this one. So let's talk about alcoholic fermentation. What happens is, first step, I still go through glycolysis. I make that pyruvic acid, and then that pyruvic acid gets broken down into something called ethyl alcohol and CO2. Okay, so once again, I had to use some of that NADH that I made in glycolysis. This is just showing my reactants, pyruvic acid, NADH, into my products, alcohol, CO2, and that NAD+. This type of fermentation occurs a lot in yeast. Yeast is not the only organism that will do alcoholic fermentation, but it's one of the most common. You might be familiar with it. We use fermentation and yeast to make bread, beer, wine, lots of things. Those bubbles when you bake bread are caused by the carbon dioxide, by the yeast going through fermentation. So typically when you bake bread, you need to add your flour, you put your yeast in there, add a little water, knead your dough together, and then you set it aside to let it rise or let it prove. So that yeast is going to start to break down that glucose that is in the wheat, in the flour and everything, and it's going to turn that into its products and make some CO2, which causes that bread to rise up and get all fluffy and delicious. Right? And the same thing with like beer. How you make beer is you get a bunch of barley and oat, whatever you're making this beer with, put it in a big vat container, add a little water, add a little yeast in there, you seal it off so no oxygen is getting in, and then the yeast is going to start to break down those sugars, that glucose in all of the barley, and release CO2 and also make some alcohol. That's how you make beer. Okay, so flowing through this glycolysis, we made pyruvic acid, NADH. Those are going to make the products of alcohol, CO2, and NAD+, once again. Okay. This is just showing you a quick breakdown of alcoholic fermentation. Got our NADH, hook up with pyruvic acid, all of our products here. Now, lastly, let's talk about some lactic acid. Okay, this is when pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid instead of alcohol. This occurs in animals. Okay, you do this. It's also used to make cheese, salami, yogurts, right? They use a special strain of bacteria called lactobacillus, which will go through some fermentation and break stuff down and make some delicious cheese. Okay. So in humans, lactic acid is going to build up when muscles operate without enough oxygen. So let's say for some reason you decide it's a good idea to go out for a run. Okay, and as you're running, your heart rate's going to start increasing, and after a little bit, you might start huffing and puffing. And the reason for that is oxygen is being directed away from your muscles into your brain because without oxygen in our brain, we would pass out and things would not be good. So your body naturally diverts oxygen to the brain. But your muscles are being deprived of that oxygen, and they still need to make energy. They still need to go through respiration because you are still running and requiring them to use energy. But they don't have the oxygen. They're not going to go through the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain. They're going to go through fermentation, get a little bit of ATP, and release lactic acid. Okay, and then that lactic acid is going to start to build up in your legs, make you feel heavy, and then the next day you're going to be pretty sore and wonder why you decided to go for a run, but it's all due to the lactic acid. Eventually, it's going to be removed by your blood and your muscles, but until then, your muscles are going to feel pretty sore. So, overview of that, glycolysis, make pyruvic acid, NADH. Those are going to form the products of lactic acid and NAD+. Here's just a little breakdown of that again. Now notice I'm not making some CO2, okay, just lactic acid and NAD+. And that concludes anaerobic respiration. We'll talk a little more about this on Friday and also do a little activity with some exercise and respiration. It's been a good time. Thanks for joining.